And with those wise words, we say hello and welcome to an all new special Juneteenth edition of the Pac-12 playlist. I'm Ashley Adamson, and Leja Clarendon is absolutely right. Despite this being the oldest nationally celebrated commemoration of the ending of slavery in the United States, a lot of people are spending today learning about Juneteenth. And with that in mind, we've got someone with us who can help educate and offer some context on this historic holiday. Dr. Kimberly McNair from the Stanford Department of African and African American Studies. We so appreciate you being with us today.
Hi, thank you for having me.
So let's just start with the basics. Can you give us a quick history lesson on what it was that exactly happened in Texas 155 years ago today?
Well, what happened exactly is that the last of enslaved Black people in the United States were informed that they had been freed 2.5 years earlier. And how we get to that point is we arrive in Galveston, Texas in 1865, and we have General Gordon Granger arrives at Ashton Villa there in Galveston, Texas, and he's standing on a balcony, and he reads General Order Number 3, which it was to inform enslaved persons that the war was over and that they had been freed. But the war ended 2.5 years prior. So a lot of questions tend to form as to how it took 2.5 years to inform all enslaved people in the United States that they had been freed. And how was it that Texas itself was so insulated that those Black persons there didn't know that they had been freed? And so the way that happened is Texas itself was shielded during the Civil War, in a sense, and isolated away from most of the goings on during the Civil War in those war years. And what happened is that not only did slaveholders refuse to release their slaves, generals refused to surrender. So it wasn't until June 2nd, 1865, that last standing Civil War general there in Texas decided to surrender to Union forces. Therefore, General Granger was able to come in and read General Order Number 3 to enslaved persons, freeing them and freeing the last of enslaved people in the United States. So that is a general quick history of how it happened. But the celebration of Juneteenth on June 19th every year comes about because the enslaved people, legend would have it, is that they didn't know exactly what date it was. It was a date that was after June the 10th. That's what they remember. And so they call it Juneteenth because they don't know exactly what day it was. Many historians state that it was absolutely on June the 19th, but legend would have it that the enslaved people didn't know exactly what day it was. So to encompass June 10th through the 19th, they called it Juneteenth, right? Because they didn't exactly know what date it was. So it began to be a celebration in 1866. Some people call it Emancipation Day, but if we look through history, Emancipation Day is actually a celebration that had been occurring since the Revolutionary War period. African Americans had been celebrating Emancipation Day during the American Revolution to commemorate the Declaration of Independence and also the promise of liberty for African Americans in the United States. So they were trying to make sense of the rhetoric of freedom and the rhetoric of liberty during the Revolutionary War and their reality as enslaved persons in the United States. So Emancipation Day was really a celebration of the American promise. And that had been occurring since the Revolutionary War period. But Jubilee Day, or Juneteenth, is what it came to be known, is what they began to celebrate 1866 and beyond. From there, 1866 to around the 1920s, you have the Reconstruction era and the Nadir period. The Reconstruction era lasting from 1863 to 1877, and you have the Nadir period lasting until the 1920s, so from 1877 until the 1920s. And what's interesting about those two periods in American history, especially African American history, is that the Nadir period is a moment where the Union troops are removed from the South, the Freedmen's Bureau leaves the South, and you have this moment of over a decade where African Americans were able to own property. Many African Americans became the first elected official and policymakers there in the South, especially. And you have this moment where you see African Americans actually rising up. They have the protection of the Union forces. to protect their rights as citizens and their newly African American women who had just gained suffrage and the right to vote. You had those rights enforced by law and enforced under protection of the Union Army. And you also had the Freedmen's Bureau there to help recuperate African Americans in terms of, healthcare, in terms of mutual aid, and in terms of education. So you see the establishment of HBCUs, historically Black colleges and universities at this time. And then you have the Nadir period where the troops are removed from the South, Hayes-Tilden Act. They're removed from the South and the Freedmen Bureau leaves. And so you have this moment of about 20, 25 years or so until the 1920s that you have an extreme moment of racial terror there in the South. And what happens during the Nadir period is you have lynchings occurring. You have the Red Summer occurring at the end of the Nadir period, 1919 to 1921. And you have African Americans calling upon themselves for unity, racial uplift, and pride, and using Juneteenth as a celebration of not only their freedom, but also the struggle that continues during that time period. So Juneteenth is taking place yearly on June 19th, being celebrated in Black churches, which was the most prominent established African-American institution at that time. And the way Juneteenth was celebrated was that it was a moment for cultural celebration, for singing, for sports events, right? Along with religious practices. So it was like a large fair every year that drew large crowds of African Americans, especially in rural areas, because in rural areas you see, because of segregation laws, because of the Black codes, in rural areas, African American communities were able to flourish in isolation. Though separate was not equal, you do have this moment where amongst themselves they could come together and celebrate without fear of racial terror, lynching, etc., that was running rampant at this time. So after the Nadir period and into the 1920s, you have the onset of the First World War. And a large part of Juneteenth is structured around what is happening in America at that time and what's happening to African Americans in response to what is happening at that time. So you have the Black codes and Jim Crow. It is still practiced as far as Jim Crow laws in the South in the 1920s. But here comes World War I and the fight against fascism worldwide, and African Americans supporting the war effort, right? African Americans as patriots, signing up to fight, especially fighting on the behalf of Ethiopia during the World War I period against fascism internationally. So as a form of patriotism, Juneteenth then, at that point, wanes in popularity. Right? Juneteenth being seen as a reminder of years past in a very, very dark time in American history as a patriotic notion, and as African Americans themselves wanted to seem American and very much on the side of the United States. They stopped celebrating Juneteenth, and it wasn't as popular in those war years as it had been in previous years. There was also a rise in xenophobia and nativism in the United States at that time, as well as, again, racial terror during the Jim Crow period. So they didn't want to be targets, and they also wanted to be as patriotic as possible in that time. So Juneteenth begins to wane in popularity in the early 20th century. But in the rise of the modern civil rights movement as we know it, right, in the 1950s, the rise of the modern civil rights movement, you see Juneteenth coming back into popularity as a way to reclaim cultural history, to reclaim the stories and the histories of ancestors. And this is a moment when you see African Americans really understanding the connection between the struggle then and the struggle in that day. And you see African Americans not only pushing towards the legalization and desegregating specific laws, you also see African Americans themselves forming an identity around what it meant to be the descendants of enslaved persons here. And so Juneteenth becomes popular once again. So whatever's happening in the United States, again, also influences what's happening with African Americans as they celebrate Juneteenth openly. Right. And then you move on to the mid 20th century, and the latter years of the modern civil rights movement. And you have Juneteenth still being a very, very popular celebration, so much so that the Poor People's Campaign, which was headed by Martin Luther King Jr., the Poor People's March on Washington in 1968 took place on Juneteenth. It took place on June 19th, 1968. So you see that the date itself is significant, as well as the celebration, which is informal. It wasn't made law. And you see that it was very popular once people left the Poor People's March there in 1968. They took that celebration back with them to their relevant hometowns and added to those communities that had already been celebrating Juneteenth for 100 years there in Texas in particular. So Juneteenth has been around for a long time. It's been around for a long time. Texas made it a state holiday back in 1980. Right, through the efforts of African-American representatives and the efforts of a multicultural coalition of persons there who wanted to make that a state holiday back in 1980. That's 40 years ago. And so Juneteenth really has been something that has been with African Americans. It's been with us nationally for quite some time. It's, Emancipation Day being celebrated at different points in different areas in the United States, because emancipation for enslaved persons happened gradually. So you had some states in the North that emancipated enslaved persons earlier than in the South, right? And so Emancipation Day was celebrated August the 1st in some areas in the North. It's celebrated in some forms on January the 1st in the South. With watch services, etc., in Black churches, and is celebrated in combination with July the 4th, Independence Day, right? So Juneteenth itself has been around in different forms for a long time, and now that it's coming back to the fore, now we see many businesses and we see many persons acknowledging Juneteenth for freedom and independence for African Americans, as opposed to July the 4th, and sometimes in combination with July the 4th. It is gaining more popularity as far as media is concerned, but it's been around for a long time.
Yeah, and you, to that point, and I appreciate that history lesson, you mentioned obviously the celebration of Juneteenth has fluctuated in the Black community. What is the significance of this holiday as we sit here today in 2020?
Well, as we sit here today in 2020, it's always been there's been this pull between the idea of liberty and the reality of racial inequality, the idea of freedom and this status of being unfreedom for African Americans in the United States since the arriving of the first enslaved persons in 1619 at Jamestown. And so it's this idea that we must make sense of, wrestle with the promise of liberty, freedom, rights as citizens, and the reality of the treatment of African Americans. So if you think about the idea of emancipation, being freed from slavery and having full citizenship rights did not save Breonna Taylor's life. Full citizenship rights did not save George Floyd's life, right? And so what does it mean to be an African American at this time and be a citizen, yet being treated as less than a second class citizens, having our life being forfeit? So it's become more prominent at this time because it's still that question. It's still that tug of war between the promise and the reality. And that has definitely come to the fore in our current moment that we're in.
You know, every holiday has its own traditions, and I'd love to hear some of the traditional ways that people celebrate Juneteenth. What goes along with this day?
Well, I won't say there are any special cuisines, right? There perhaps in Texas and in that area, Oklahoma, Louisiana, and the areas that picked up Juneteenth earlier on, and they've been celebrating Juneteenth for quite some time. They're probably cuisine, but as a person from North Carolina, I don't believe there are any special cuisines, but there are events right? That take place in community centers, maybe cultural bazaars, book festivals. You know, I've seen concerts, blues concerts, and the like, moments to celebrate Black culture and cultural production, art festivals, etc. And so there's a lot that can be celebrated in culmination with recognizing Juneteenth as a holiday, that these are not necessarily special cuisines that you eat only on that day, but it is a time to come together for Black culture overall. So many things happen on Juneteenth. It's not all political, it's not all religious, it's not all cultural. It's a lovely amalgamation of Black culture.
Well, I want to go back to the political part because, you know, Juneteenth, as you've referenced, it's recognized as a holiday in almost every state. We've seen organizations this year like NFL, Nike, and Twitter recognize it for the first time as a paid company holiday. What do you think it will take for this to be a nationally recognized holiday in the U.S.?
The best way to compare what it will take will say, I'd say, what did it take for MLK Day to become a national holiday, right? And there's work that has to be done on the state level and work that has to be done on the federal level. So in a sense, people have already celebrated Juneteenth for roughly 155 years now. So the culture changes, and then policy and law tend to catch up. And so on the state level, you see states like Virginia and New York passing resolutions to make Juneteenth observed holidays there in their states. What would also occur is that there will be a Senate bill or a bill in Congress introduced and proposed to make Juneteenth a national holiday. And then a president would sign that into law, right, making it a federal holiday, right? So that means a presidential signature and movement on the congressional level. But right now, really, as far as it being significant, if Juneteenth is already celebrated in Black households, right, then that national holiday would be very meaningful. However, we need more than just the establishment of national holidays. It would be beautiful to have another recognized holiday along with Black History Month, along with, I'm from North Carolina, so we have watch services on January the 1st to celebrate emancipation as well. But other than these notions of having federal holidays and paid leave, et cetera, we need other movement on the policy level. So I think it's beautiful. I think the notion is lovely that it may become a federal holiday now that more people are talking about it. More people are noticing that the history of the United States has unfolded differently for African descended persons.
Yeah, and as you said, the culture shift has to happen first, and then
yes. So yeah,
you've given us a ton of great historical context. I'd love to ask you, as the last thing on this holiday, what does Juneteenth mean to you, Professor McNair?
Wow, what does Juneteenth mean to me? Well, that's deep. Thank you for that question. What does Juneteenth mean to me? I am the great granddaughter of enslaved people, and I know the plantations, I know the farms. My mother grew up on a hog farm, and the family worked on a cotton farm when they were renting on a hog farm. And so what it means to me is, one, it's a large thank you to the ancestors that survived. And it is recognition of our continual survival, it's recognition of our continued struggle, yet we persevere. And it's a recognition and celebration of the beauty of Black people and all that they've contributed to the world. That's what Juneteenth means to me. So it's not only about the history of enslavement on these shores, but it's also about African descended persons and their history beyond and before that great departure from Mother Africa. So our history does not begin in enslavement. Our history came before that. We are so much greater than those that survived enslavement. We've made contributions to the world beyond measure. So that's what Juneteenth means to me.
That was a beautiful answer, and I thank you for that. I don't have the opportunity to get to learn from someone like you every day, and so before we let you go, I was looking at your bio to get ready for this interview. I'd love to share a little bit, for you to share a little bit about your background and your story, and some of the research that you've been involved in is fascinating, and I'd I'd love our listeners to be able to hear about it.
Okay. Well, my artifact as a historian, I'm trained in African American and African diaspora studies. And I studied Black studies at North Carolina State, UCLA, and UC Berkeley. So one of the first generations to be able to say that I studied, African American studies all the way through. And my artifact as a historian is the T-shirt. The T-shirt. So in terms of material culture, in terms of African American social movements, I study the T-shirt and the production of T-shirts in African American political movements from roughly 1965 to the present moment. I end my study at 2015. So that's about 50 years of history of T-shirts coming out of Black social movements. So I start with the Black Panther Party and I end at Black Lives Matter. And I do quite a bit, but most of my work deals with thinking about the T-shirt as a memory object, thinking about the T-shirt in processes of mourning and processes of protest and celebration. So that's my work. I came to that topic being a student at UCLA and noticing all of the slogan T-shirts coming about in the early mid 2000s. So I saw students wearing Fred Hampton T-shirts and Angela Davis T-shirts and John Carlos and Tommy Smith T-shirts, all of 18 and 19 years old. And when asked, well, where'd you get that T-shirt? Well, I got it from so-and-so store for $40, $40 T-shirt. But I'd see the same T-shirt on Venice Beach or at some book fair for $5, right? So it's like, what's happening here? And what does my generation believe they have in common with my mother and grandmother's generation? Was this generational, transgenerational conversation taking place? And from 2004, 2005 to the present, I've been studying T-shirts ever since.
So what is that commonality? I mean, that's fascinating to think about it through the lens of a T-shirt, but what is that commonality? What have you found?
Well, what I found is that, it's not cliche because it's true, but there's a saying that the struggle continues. We are facing the same societal ills that our parents and grandparents faced, with little change when it comes to policing, American policing of African American communities and African American people, regardless of where we are, school, work, in our communities. The policing of Black persons, right? Educational opportunities, equity in terms of income and employment opportunities, right? Labor insecurity, housing insecurity. We are facing some of the same issues, and therefore, how do we illustrate, right? How do we not only celebrate our leaders, but also illustrate the continuation of that struggle? How do we illustrate a change in the ways that we organize against those struggles? So that is the commonality, is that we're fighting the same fights. And I believe that we've picked up the baton pretty well and we're running with it, but we're fighting the same fights. And so that's the conversation that had to dwell on me after getting past, oh, these images are being co-opted. Who's making money from the T-shirts? And what's going on here when wearing a T-shirt might not translate into actual action? I got past that. That's like the beginning level of the questions as far as T-shirt wearers and T-shirt makers. And like a flower, it just unfolded to me this idea that T-shirts facilitate a discussion. T-shirts trouble specific rhetoric around Black victimization and Black victims, right? It troubles rhetoric around Black radicalism and participation. You can see a change in not only the ways that people organize, but a change in ideology from focusing on these charismatic leaders that we see at the center of T-shirts and focusing more on the whole of the Black community and the policing of Black communities and criminalization of Black communities as a whole through T-shirts. And I try to do that in my work.
It's all so fascinating. I appreciate your perspective and the work that you've done so much. Last thing, You're obviously so well versed and educated on the history of African Americans in the US and everything that has gone into that. Where do you think, if you can put in context, and I know we're going to have to be able to look back to know the full context of this moment, but what would you say in terms of the context of the Black Lives Moment right now? How would you describe it as it fits into the larger history?
How would I describe the current moment we're in as it fits into the larger history of African Americans? Hmm. People say watershed a lot, right? People say pivotal point, breaking point, you know. They use those terms a lot. And where does it fit in? I just want to say that we have not been here before. And I just want to double down and reiterate that we have not been here before in the middle of two pandemics. COVID-19, that pandemic, as well as the idea that anti-Black policing is a global practice. It has been practiced for a very long time. So those are two pandemics that are facing African Americans at this time. And where does it fit in? Well, it doesn't necessarily stand on its own because so many moments have brought us here. But we need to understand it in and of itself as a point where we've never been. This is an economic downturn, pandemic. We're entering into economic depression era, numbers of unemployment. The only thing that hasn't happened is a war, right? So there are many moments that would change the direction that the United States goes in, and a war would be one of them. But you have this illness, this pandemic, and you have this economic downturn that's happening on top of mass protests in the street, all from policing, right? And understanding that police brutality does not only affect African Americans, but we see the plight of African Americans in policing at the forefront. So where it fits in, it is a continuation of the struggles that we went through 7-8 years ago with Trayvon Martin. It's a continuation of the struggles we went through in the 1990s with the Rodney King verdict. What happened to Tasha Harlins, right? It's a continuation of the Trans-African movement and the anti-apartheid struggle. It's a continuation of the cultural wars that were happening in the 80s and 1970s. It's a continuation of the modern civil rights movement and the Black Power movement. Go back on and on and on, the labor movements of the early 1920s and 1930s. It's a continuation of the first revolt of enslaved and kidnapped persons on the first slave ships in the Atlantic. So it is a long struggle, right? And it is a continuation of that, but we have special circumstances right now that make the ground ripe and fruitful for true change. And I hope that we don't stop fighting until things absolutely change.
That is so perfectly said. I really appreciate your time today, Professor McNair. You mentioned Cal and UCLA is where you studied, but you've also worked at USC and you're obviously at Stanford now. So you've got the four-way trifecta, I guess, of Pac-12 schools in California. You're a Carolina girl in a California world. Is that what you call yourself?
Yes, yes.
Well, Pac-12 is lucky to have you. Thank you so much again for your time and all of your insight. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you. Thank you for having me.